Hey, I'm Felissa Rose, and you're watching Keto and Crime.
Computers, they power everything that goes on in life. Sometimes people use them for unscrupulous things, like my recent hacking issue, which you can check out on a previous video. But for the most part, computers have made our lives much simpler and much better. However, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, there was a phenomenon known as the value-added reseller. These were people that basically did business with the big boys like Apple, like HP, like Toshiba, like whoever, at Microsoft, and they would basically buy hardware, buy the software, and take orders from customers and act as a third-party intermediary for the big boys and resell their products to businesses and people with value-added services. Like a company might hire one of these value-added resources to staff their help desk or be on-call IT support or be, any number of things. So there was always some value added, such as a service contract or something else. So these flourished in the 90s and early 2000s, and one of them was owned by a man named Barton Watson, who created, along with some business partners, a company known as CyberNET. However, his was a little different because his was built on absolutely nothing. And when the case broke, we found out that his entire life had been a lie, even a previous relationship, that he had built a business on lies, on tall tales, and on scams. And with that being said, we're going to look at the man who faked his way through life, Barton Watson, and CyberNET on a Keto and Crime Classic. Here is 2019 Tracy telling you all about it. Have a great day.
Hey everyone, we're back. For those of you watching on YouTube, welcome. For those of you listening via Thought Crime, welcome. I think you're going to enjoy this one. This is a very interesting, this is what I call Ponzi scheme plus, because that's definitely what it is. It was definitely a Ponzi scheme, but kind of functioned in a different way than most Ponzi schemes, and we'll get into that. But let's get into it. Barton Watson and CyberNET. Barton Watson was born October 18th, 1960 in the city of Belding, Michigan. He was the son of Gerald Watson and Geraldine Johnson Wallace. Gerald and Geraldine. That's kind of unusual, but that's where he started. His father was a very successful merchant in Belding, which is a medium-sized to small town in Michigan. He owned several stores of different types, and so they did live a very privileged lifestyle. They had sort of an upper-middle-class lifestyle. His mother, Geraldine, stayed at home. He had one brother, and Barton was a very, very ambitious child. He did very well in school, attended both Belding Elementary and later on Belding High School. And his father used to say that he would come into his father's home office and kind of pull up a desk next to him and sit down and say, "Dad, I want to open a store. Dad, I want to help you do a deal. Dad, I want to be a businessman just like you." And so Gerald kind of fed that. And so, as a result, Barton actually knew from the very start he wanted to be an entrepreneur. So that's kind of how he carried himself. When he got to middle school and later on into high school, he wasn't very popular. Friends say that he was kind of the brunt of a lot of bullying because of the way he dressed. He didn't wear jeans and shirts to school like most kids. He wore slacks, button-up shirts, sometimes a tie and jacket. And he carried his books around in a briefcase or an attaché case instead of a book bag or a backpack. And you can imagine what happens to that kid. in school, so he didn't have a whole lot of friends. He wasn't very popular, and so the only thing he had was his studies and his entrepreneurial pursuits, which started very young. While in middle school, Barton actually started a periodical, a quarterly periodical, later on a monthly periodical, for horsemen and horsewomen, for people that loved horses and participated in equestrian events, called the American Horseman. He published it himself. He took all the pictures himself. He sold it both by mail order and door to door. He would take out ads in newspapers and magazines, all paid for with proceeds from the magazine and from money borrowed from his father, which he did pay back. And he would sell this, and he would publish it. He would write the stories, publish it, and distribute it himself. And that went on for several years, and he was able to save up quite a chunk of money toward his college from running this magazine until he eventually put it to bed during his senior year of high school. So he did some amazing things, and if he had put his brain toward other pursuits instead of what he got into, could have been easily another Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, quite easily. His parents divorced during his last year of middle school, and so his father moved to Grand Rapids. His mom and he, immediately after he graduated from high school, were thinking about moving to Washington, D.C., and they did relocate to Arlington, Virginia, lived there for a while, and then got an apartment actually in D.C. Barton kind of helped her get moved, get settled, and then he enrolled at the University of Michigan. He was only there one semester, but then he decided it was time to go and help support his mother, who was having a hard time dealing with forcing his father to pay alimony and things like that. So he said, well, forget it, I don't need college, I'll just go help my mom. So that's what happened. He moved to Washington, D.C., again with his mom, and decided to look for a job. As you can imagine, only having one semester of college under your belt, not easy to get anything but perhaps a serving job. He did serve and wait tables at a few restaurants around town, but a lot of the people he would wait on would be stockbrokers, and this is in the early 80s, 1980, 81. So he was waiting on these brokers that were in the heyday of the greed is good. You know, the Gordon Geckos of the world. They made a lot of money working in boiler room situations, and he wanted a part of that. So he said, what do I have to do to be part of that? Well, as it turns out, you didn't need a college degree. All you had to do was pass a few certification exams known as the Series 6 and Series 7. I actually passed those once upon a time when I sold insurance with variable products in them. The brokerage and the brokerage ethics exam, all you have to do is study for those and pass them, and that's what he did. Without a college degree, he got his Series 7 and Series 6 and faked a resume. Like, once upon a time, you had resume books. You had these big, thick books that you could buy at any bookstore or get at your local library that had examples of effective resumes in them. And he actually got one of those and pretty much copied one that was a financial resume to the hilt. Kind of reminds you of that movie with Christina Applegate, Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter is Dead, where she copied her resume from a resume book. It's exactly what he did.
I'm right on top of that, Rose.
He totally faked his resume, pretended that he had indeed graduated from Michigan, and had a huge history in finance when all he had done is pass the Series 6 and Series 7. But being that as it was, he was able to get a job as a junior broker with E.F. Hutton. Remember when E.F. Hutton speaks? Yeah.
Well, my broker's E.F. Hutton, and Hutton says, when E.F. Hutton talks, people listen.
So he was able to get a job. He started out as a junior broker assisting Perry Bacon. Now, Perry Bacon would get himself into a whole lot of trouble and actually resign from the firm in 1985 because he got caught up in the famous E.F. Hutton check kiting scam. What is check kiting?
Hey everyone, welcome to the wonderful world of check kiting. Let's check it out. Let's say a business has an account with Bank A that has $10,000 in it. They then write a check for $20,000 from that account, and they take that check over to Bank B and open a new account. They then withdraw what they can from that account and flip business really quick. That's check kiting, and you should never try it at home.
Bear in mind, check kiting could not be done today because you really need a kind of turnover time from the time you deposit a check to the time it clears. And back in the day when people still wrote paper checks, you had literally up to 5 business days before a check actually cleared. And check kiting was trying to turn a profit off writing fraudulent checks during that turnover time. So basically what they would do, what Perry Bacon got the Arlington, Virginia, D.C. area, E.F. Hutton into doing, and a lot of other branches did this too, and E.F. Hutton got into a lot of trouble, look it up, in the early 80s. I might do a video on it if there's any interest. Let me know down below. But basically what they would do is they would write a check for more than the total amount they had in one E.F. Hutton account, and then they would take that check and use it to start an account at another bank. So they wrote a check to Bank of America from, let's say, a J.P. Chase bank. So they wrote a check to Bank of America from Chase, just as an example, to start for more than they had in that Chase account, to start an account at Bank of America. And so what would happen in that interim, by the time it took Bank of America and Chase to reconcile those checks, they essentially got a 0 interest loan for that amount. So if they had $50,000 in Chase and wrote a check for $60,000 and then used that to open an account at Bank of America, they had an extra $10,000 courtesy of Chase and an extra $60,000 or whatever they would give you credit for immediately in a new account, anywhere from $10,000 to up to the full amount of the deposit from Bank of America. So just an example, and they did this not with big banks like Bank of America and Chase. They did this with small credit unions, small Midwestern regional banks, that kind of thing. So these were banks that didn't have the sophistication of a mega bank, and they could easily file for it. So let's just say they got these interest-free loans, and during that 5 days, they would flip a lot of deals with that money. They would have deals ready, set up, go, and they would essentially do it with stolen money. And then when everything fell out, with both checks bounced, they would say, oh, it was an accounting error, we're going to fire that clerk or whatever. And then they would just simply take the money they earned from the profits from their business dealings, make it right with both banks, and then they still had a hefty profit left over. So that's what check kiting is. And it's not exactly legal. The closest thing that you could compare it to today would be cracking bank cards. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but I've actually seen some videos on it. Not recommending anybody try this, but this is the closest you would get to it. When you crack a card, you basically use an ATM card to make a deposit with a bad check. And a lot of ATMs, you do it at the ATM so that you actually get the first $300 worth of credit or $500 worth of credit actually credited to your balance. So what you do, you use your ATM card to make a deposit, to make a phony deposit, and then you withdraw that money out, and you essentially crack the card. You've got a free loan for a couple of days or 48 hours, ever how long it takes to make that right. So, yeah. Essentially, that's what it was. That's the modern iteration of it. You have very little time to make it work, but back then you could have 5, maybe even 10 business days to flip your deal and then get the money back to the bank. So E.F. Hutton's branches were doing this and showing record profits because they were working with essentially stolen money or loans at 0% interest, however you want to look at it. And so Perry Bacon and a lot of the branches got in trouble, and Perry Bacon was actually fired from E.F. Hutton in 1985, but he don't feel too bad for him. He did exit with a $600,000 severance package. So you can look that up. Like I said, if you're interested in me doing a whole video on the E.F. Hutton check kiting scandal of the 80s, let me know. I'll be happy to do it. So that's the type of person that Barton Watson learned from. It's kind of like Wolf of Wall Street, Jordan Belfleur learned from McConaughey's character, who taught him to do things not quite on the up and up. So that's what happened to Barton Watson. He learned kind of shifting the system. And Barton Watson got caught up in that check kiting. He also learned to churn and burn, which means you basically keep making microtransactions and larger transactions on a certain client's accounts and getting that commission. So whether or not it benefited the client, if you kept money moving within their account, you got a commission off that. So he got in trouble a little bit later on for embezzlement from with 7 of his clients because he kept moving their money around. Not only was he moving it from stock to stock and taking commissions off that, he was buying like whole life policies, variable universal life insurance policies, things that had some risk to them. And he was actually faking P.O. boxes, so these people were getting notices that they had these life insurance policies that they had purchased, but they never got the actual policy because it was going to Barton Watson via a P.O. box. So, yeah, he got caught up in that and got in trouble for embezzlement and ended up being let go from the firm in 1984. And along with that, he got a 3 years in federal prison for the embezzlement and churning. And he served 3 years in federal prison. He actually went into prison in 1987 because it took from 1984 when he got caught to 1987 to actually get sentenced. During that time, he was still living with his mom. He had met a fiancée who I shall not mention, but she worked also at 𝗬𝗏, and she was the secretary or administrative assistant to one of the VPs. He started wining and dining her. She said that he bought her all this fancy stuff that after, and she had actually moved in with he and his mom, and his mom controlled everything. She took his paycheck, she took her paycheck, she paid all the family bills. Both Barton and his fiancée got an allowance instead of actually being able to spend their own money. She said it was a very weird dynamic that Barton was always trying to win his mother's admiration and affection. So anyway, when Barton went to prison, of course, the mother and the fiancé were kind of falling on hard times because they were only living off what little alimony they could get out of Barton's father, plus her paycheck from 𝗬𝗏. And then, of course, when they realized that she was dating Barton, she was let go too. So basically, she was kind of destitute after he went to prison. So she took a lot of the fancy gifts he had bought her, including her engagement ring, art, that sort of thing, took it to a pawn shop and auction houses to get estimates on getting those sold. So that because she needed money to get out and get her own apartment and try to find another job. All of it was fake. Every bit of it was fake. So we're kind of seeing a pattern here with Barton. He likes to put on a good show, but there's really not anything of sustenance there. So he served 3 years in federal prison, and after getting out of prison, he moved from D.C. back to Michigan, to Grand Rapids, Michigan, where his father actually lived, and kind of made up with his father, lived with his father for a bit, and waited tables at a Red Lobster restaurant while trying to save money. He was also helped move his mom from D.C. back to Grand Rapids, because eventually they had lived in Belding, Michigan, and kind of set her up there, and then kind of moved in with her, again, back under that same old thumb. But Barton had a plan. He didn't want to wait tables the rest of his life. He was banned from ever dealing in securities or working for a financial institution of any type by the federal conviction, so he was kind of limited in what he could do. His Series 7 and Series 6 license were no longer worth the paper they were printed on at that time. So he decided to kind of reinvent himself. Instead of being Barton Watson, he was now Barton Watson III. He actually legally changed his name, even though there wasn't a Barton Watson Sr. or Jr. So he kind of changed his name up a little bit, changed his appearance, lost weight, that sort of thing, and he decided to get into tech because this is 1990. This is right as the tech bubble was starting to rise. The internet was still a fairly new thing. Al Gore had just invented it and stuff. So it was starting to rise in popularity. Some people still thought it was a fad, but some people had the vision that this is the way things were going. So he knew that was a thing. So he realized that tech was the next big thing. So he started working at a large computer store. And while there, he met a fellow employee by the name of John Strayer. And together, they figured they could go into business for themselves. They could get into something known as value-added reselling, which is basically something that was very big in the 90s and early 2000s, where small companies would pop up. They would buy things like hardware and software from the big boys, and then they would resell it to clients at a markup. And also, for that, the clients would get them or their technicians coming in and setting everything up, networking it out for them, maintaining it. They would get services along with the actual product. So they might buy an HP computer and Microsoft Windows from Strayer and Watson. They would mark those up 10% right away, and then they would charge an additional fee for them coming in, setting up the computer, installing the software, showing them how to operate it. And then if you got on with a company that had like a internal network, internal or intranet network, they would set that up for them, and they would monitor it all for a fee. So they got into value-added reselling. And for a long time, things went really, really well. They made a lot of money. They called it WS Services. Made a lot of money. But then Strayer introduced Watson to the secretary of his father, a woman named 𝗙𝗶𝗪, and Barton became infatuated with her. He wined her and dined her. He bought her all these presents just like he did his former fiancée, some of them real, some of them fake. And 𝗙𝗏 kind of became obsessed with the type of lifestyle that Barton could give her, and Barton wanted to impress her. So in 1993, John Strayer became suspicious that perhaps all the monies coming into WS Services weren't on the up and up, that there was something wrong. He suspected that he was being shown a QuickBooks breakdown here, but he didn't suspect that was real, because as a VP and as a salesperson, he kind of knew what was coming in. So he knew that revenues weren't exactly matching profits, and he was suspicious. He didn't think much of it. But then in 1993, he was about to do a sales presentation for another potential client and needed a floppy disk. Now, this is when you still had the little small floppy disks. He needed a disk to put his presentation on, and he went looking for one. He found one in Barton Watson's office. He actually took it back to his office, put it in his computer to see if something was on it, and lo and behold, there was a whole bunch of QuickBook files. He started going through them and realized indeed there were 2 sets of books, and he was only given half the story. He immediately printed out all this information, returned the disk to Barton Watson's desk, and went out and consulted an attorney. Well, in 1993, it blew up. They ended up going to court, and they countersued each other. And in the end, they settled for dissolving WS Services, and which they had actually rebranded as CyberNET Engineering by that time. They actually dissolved their partnership and their company. John got bought out by Barton, and Barton kept the name. And John Strayer has later been quoted as saying that he got a $100,000 check and wrote $80,000 over to his attorney. So he didn't really profit off of it, but Barton got the business, the name, and he and 𝗙𝗏 rebuilt CyberNet in their vision, which was to make as much money as possible. They rebranded CyberNet as Cyberco, the Cyberco Group. They bought a historical building in downtown Grand Rapids, and they started opening branch offices around the country. They were, according to them, selling network plans and service plans like hotcakes. They hired a whole new sales staff, and they did have some legitimate business, but they didn't have enough legitimate business to expand the way they wanted to. So them and their CFO hatched a plan to start basically doing that repackaged Ponzi scheme that we talked about. What would happen? They were literally faking accounts. They would fake clients within their book of business and also kind of inflate the invoices owed to them by legitimate clients to show that they had much more revenue and much more profit than they actually did. And with this phony set of books, they would go to banks, one of the main ones being Huntington National Bank out of California, and to loan houses and finance companies, and they would take out $100,000 million loans to buy the software and hardware needed to service all these clients. And the banks just believed them and loaned them millions of dollars to do whatever they wanted to do. But instead of actually using it to do business, part of it went to open new offices and kind of make them look good. They opened all these flashy offices. They had CyberNET coffee cups, CyberNET mouse pads, CyberNET whatever. You know, you get a turd and stamp CyberNET on it. They had it. So they made themselves look good, but there really wasn't anything of sustenance except for their few legitimate clients. So they used it to fund lavish lifestyles, big houses, parties, vacations, boats, cars, you name it. You know the game with these Ponzi people. And they would take out other loans to make the payments on their current loan. So it was just like a Ponzi scheme, whereas you use the investments from new clients to pay off old clients. Here they would take out new loans to pay off old loans. And it's fine as long as the money keeps coming in, but then like everything, it kind of cracks. In 2004, they had two bad things. One of their sales reps had closed a deal with the Hastings, Michigan school system to supply brand new computers and Windows software and Office for all of their schools. He came in early one day and went into the break room, and he saw all these boxes sitting around the break room with a refurbished tag on them. And he saw temporary workers sitting there with hair dryers, hair drying the tags to make them brittle so they could pull them off. And he went immediately to Barton's office and asked, what are these refurbished computers? We're supposed to be setting up new computers for the school system, where Barton immediately fired him and told him he needed to keep his mouth shut, made him sign a non-disclosure under duress, and exited him out of the building. Well, first of all, he knew that anything signed under duress will not hold up in a court of law, so he went to the local police department and later to the FBI and told them what he had seen. Along the same line, their accountant, Guy Heaston, started realizing that something wasn't quite right because the books just weren't balancing. And he also reached out to the local accounting authority and mentioned it, as well as reaching out to the local police department and FBI. Well, in 2004, the FBI put together their case, and by the end of 2004, about October, November, they raided all of CyberNet's offices and took everything, confiscated everything so they could finish their investigation. While there, they realized they had a phone bank in the main Grand Rapids headquarters that was basically a switchboard, where the phone for their other branches, some of them were just P.O. boxes they had opened in other towns to show that they were growing, to show that they had offices there. When somebody would call that number for a local branch, it would ring into the switchboard in the main office. So they had all those phones ringing in there so they could make the ruse look legitimate. Also, when they broke into CyberNet's server room, they saw all these brand new compact servers, all these brand new with all kinds of blinking lights and stuff. Looked real legitimate until they actually had a computer expert look into them. There wasn't a single bit of data on them. They were just blinking LED lights. There was nothing attached to them, nothing of any substance. So they were just really heavy, blinking light paperweights. So this is the extent that Barton Watson had went to make his company look legitimate. November 24th, 2004. 911 call comes into the Grand Rapids area 911. It's Barton Watson. He tells the dispatcher, "Do you know who I am?" The dispatcher says, "No, sir, I don't know who you are." He said, "Have you heard about CyberNet and their missing CEO?" Because he ran. When the offices were raided, he ran. They've been looking for him, and finally he went home and made this 911 call. And the dispatcher said, "I have heard of that, but what is that to you?" And he goes, "Well, I'm the missing CyberNet CEO."
I just want to know why you want to kill yourself.
Well, have you watched the news lately?
Some.
Some?
Generally.
And I've got a gun in my mouth. And so the guy started trying to talk him down as you would, but to no avail. Barton Watson did commit suicide November 24th, 2004, in his home while talking to a 911 dispatcher. The fallout was huge. CyberNET declared bankruptcy, went out of business. Everyone lost their jobs. Any financial institution that had lent them money were kind of out of luck, as well as the investors in those financial institutions. All of CyberNet's co-conspirators were sentenced in 2007. James Horton, who was one of the VPs, got 7.5 years. Paul Wright got 2.5 years. Crystal Watson got 7 years in prison, and they all had to pay restitution up to $23 million. And the kicker is, Barton Watson got out of it scot-free. So, as you can imagine, not the best ending, and the fallout's still going on. Huntington National Bank in California, was one of the biggest loaners to CyberNet of money, and they're currently being sued by their own investors because they didn't do enough due diligence to find out that this whole thing was one big Ponzi scheme.
My clients are the victims of the fraud, and what Judge Hughes' ruling does is essentially right a wrong that was done to them.
This is Doug Donnell. He represents the group of creditors suing Huntington Bank for allegedly ignoring the red flags that the company was a fake. This week, the federal judge handed down a ruling that details how the bank failed to act in good faith, saying it ignored red flags that something wasn't right. Court documents show suspicions surfaced at the bank before everything came crashing down. A security officer at Huntington learned Barton Watson was a con man, but didn't share that information. The judge writes in this 65-page opinion, Huntington, without question, wanted its money back. It really didn't matter to Huntington how Cyberco went about doing it. That's why the judge ruled the bank may be liable for more than $73 million.
These creditors have waited a long time to be vindicated, if you will. This ruling stands for the proposition that the wrong is going to be righted, and that the people from whom the money was stolen will get it back.
The bank denies knowing anything was wrong. It released a statement that reads, Huntington has vigorously contested the claims of this case since its inception and expects to continue to do so.
So that's the huge difference between the 1990s, early 2000s, and now. I don't think you could pull this off now. So, anyway, that's the story of CyberNet. I'll be back with you soon. Thanks so much, guys. 𝗙𝗶𝗁𝗄. Out.